Good afternoon, Ed.
Good afternoon, Mark.
So welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and this is I think the fourth or fifth in the Fireside Chat series of Blogging Heads that we've been doing, kind of organized by me and colleagues at the Roosevelt Institute. So very excited here to be here with Ed Luce, the columnist for the Financial Times, former Washington bureau chief of the Financial Times, and author of the new book called Time to Start Thinking, which is about American decline, and which I totally enjoyed. I read it on the Nook, actually, not the Kindle, but the Nook. So I don't have a copy of the book to hold up. If you happen to maybe hold one up to the camera, but Ed, why don't you? I said you'd introduce yourself, and then I kind of jumped ahead and introduced you. But
you did it very well.
Say a little bit more about who you are, and of course, and we've known each other for a number of years. My wife was a colleague of yours at PFT.
Absolutely, and much missed.
So I was amazed by how quickly this book appeared. I think we had a conversation. I remember talking to you about it on New Year's Day, barely a year ago, and it was an idea, and now it's a book. So I think that's remarkably impressive. So why don't you reintroduce yourself and then say a little bit about how you came to write this book, and then I read the first half of it at my normal pace and the second half of it at a high pace. But I have some thoughts about it and some questions I want to ask you, although I do want to mostly say that I think it's a fantastic book.
Well, first of all, it's really kind of you to invite me to do this, as well as to read my book. So thank you on both those counts. Conversation we had 15 months ago, it wasn't quite that instant. I mean, I took... I think I sold it to the publishers, Atlantic Grove, here in Little Brown in Britain, in mid-2010, and had been sort of thinking about the synopsis for the previous year or so. But you're right, it didn't go into sort of execution. The FT were very kind to give me 9 months leave of absence from the newspaper, and so I made full use of those 9 months, and had the great pleasure of being able to travel extensively outside of the Beltway in order to do my interviews for this book and research.
And you really did travel extensively. I mean, it's a really wonderful kind of travel around America type book with a lot of Michigan, Texas, Oregon.
Yeah, I
really did cover a lot of ground.
Yeah, I mean, it was that was one of the sort of real joys of doing this book. I mean, I've done a lot of traveling around America, but a disproportionate share of it has been doing campaign coverage. And much as I like Iowa, it never, New Hampshire and places like that, and Ohio, I preferred, I guess, the Florida bit of the swing stateness in the 2008 election and the 2006
right.
and 2010 midterm elections. But this took me to what I deliberately try to do is on the ground real economy of America, the stuff that isn't always covered in the horse race or even acknowledged sometimes in the horse race. And what initially got me interested in this book was actually pre-recession, pre-07 recession, certainly pre-Lehman Brothers meltdown, and therefore pre-Obama administration, was the deep-rooted problem of I think what others also call the triple cocktail of median wage stagnation in the United States, affecting
such
a large proportion of the middle class, declining income mobility, which is obviously a fairly newish and pretty un-American phenomenon. That the US is now behind most other developed economies in terms of your chances of jumping a quintile. That's the second piece, and the third, of course, is the Great Gatsby on steroids, sort of trends towards growing inequality, and what I sometimes call the Latin Americanization of the American economy. And that triple cocktail was what initially got me interested, because it's clearly structural and deeply rooted. This isn't a sort of quarter-to-quarter trend that's jumping around, and I think it's to do with the very important trends of globalization and an exponentially changing technology and how that affects the world of work and the middle class. And I guess what came to me more latterly is the degree to which this also impacts on national competitiveness. And that's essentially the frame in which my book addresses these trends is what does this also mean for America's overall competitiveness as an economy in a world where others are rising and where, America's share of world GDP is naturally and inevitably falling quite quickly. I mean, just to cite one number, at the turn of the century, America had about 31% share of world GDP, and that's fallen to 23.5% by 2011, according to the IMF exchange rate-based numbers, not their purchasing power parity numbers. And it's in that context that I felt this is a really important set of subjects. They're complex, right, but they are coherent.
Right. Well, let me ask you a couple. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead because I had something I was going to start by asking you about. But since you mentioned something like share of share of world GDP, it seems to me there's a couple of different things that go on in a story of American decline, and one part is simply relative economic growth compared to China and India, and some of that is either that's just how life is going to be, or maybe you even want it to be that way. I mean, in fact, I remember it was actually Bob Wright who founded Blogging Heads, saying once, either here or I think it was in a meeting I was with him once, where he said something like, if China and India are rapidly growing their share of world GDP, something really tragic would happen to make that be the case. That's not going to be a good thing for anyone.
I fully agree.
So a certain amount of relative decline is not in itself the end of the world, right?
No, it's not, and I think that's very well observed. And in an even bigger even higher altitude way of looking at this, is the way that Mike Spence describes it in his book. The Nobel Prize economist from Stanford describes it in his book, The Great Convergence. That since 1750 or thereabouts, the West, which is only about 15% of the world's population, including America more latterly, has monopolized the Industrial Revolution and the development story, and often at the expense of the remaining 85, mostly non-white proportion of the world's population. And this catch-up is not just inevitable, but it's also highly desirable. And to go even further than that, a product of the Pax Americana and the sort of global public goods that the US has supplied, and then one stage further, even a growing market for American products, talent. So I would certainly not wish to describe the rise of others as a negative phenomenon, even from America's point of view.
Right. But there are other levels of. I mean, I guess it seemed to me in reading the book that there were sort of three different kinds of decline. One is that kind of relative decline, some of which might be bad, but some of it might be the result of actually desirable things that are happening. And then there were kind of things that if we could get them right, we could fix them. And then there were things that were really deeply doomed on. And I think the book did it. The book kind of moves through all three of those and kind of does a good job in distinguishing them, I think. But they are somewhat different stories, right?
They are somewhat different stories. I mean, bear in mind, though, that this relative shift in global GDP is happening at breakneck speed. And and that accelerated speed is being enabled by these factors, globalization and technology, that are intruding upon the way the American economy is configured, not just the way it distributes its fruits, but the way in which people live and work, that are helping accelerate that relative decline, or relative ascent, if you like, of the BRIC countries and others. And I think, the decline that I focus on is in the quality of American public policy response to these kinds of challenges, these associated challenges. And, I do pick up on that sense of pragmatism for which America is so deservedly famed, initially described, although not named, by de Tocqueville, the practical, addressing the practical, the empirical, rather than trying to make things work in theory, as his countryman did in his description. And then, of course, that word pragmatic was coined by an American. And I think that there is a pragmatism missing in action sense to America's political response to these challenges, and that's an understatement, of course. I mean, you look at today's budget, and about the only area that Washington can agree on to freeze is that 15% domestic non-discretionary, domestic discretionary non-defense portion of the budget, which contains all the tomorrow items, the R&D, the infrastructure, education. And that's not a pragmatic response to the challenges America is facing. That's really the decline I'm focused principally on in this book.
Right. I have to say, I think my favorite, there's a lot that I liked about the book. My favorite element of it is, in a sense, what's not there, because one often expects a book, a typical classic, if Tom Friedman were writing this book, it would have a lot about the federal budget deficit, and you have almost nothing about the federal budget deficit other than as how it's been a focus that's been a part of the kind of failure of the pragmatic policy response, not the sort of we're doomed because, look at these numbers, blah, 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 which I think is the far smarter way to think about it. There's no, we need a third party that will, elect a president that will lift us away from all that. I mean, it's really, I think what's interesting about it is that you have, in addition to, a strong view of certain problems, you also bring to it kind of a skepticism about certain solutions. Like I think your chapter on education is really thoughtful about the ways in which, yes, I mean, we have this, tremendously unequal education system, leaving a lot of people behind, a lot of basic skills that are missing. And then, when you talk to Bill Gates and others, you kind of bring that idea that, well, if we could just get the metrics about what works in place, we'll get this whole thing fixed. And I think you bring a lot of skepticism about that. That idea. Yeah,
I mean, I think I agree with all your observation. I mean, not the ones positive about me, but you characterize my book well. And I think, to pick up on your first observation, the fiscal, I actually was researching and writing this book during the whole 2011 roller coaster in Washington over the budget, over the fiscal term. Deficit reduction, over the sovereign debt ceiling, and from Simpson Bowles onwards, most of 2011 was squandered on that fruitless debate, and of course it's just set ourselves up for what people are now calling the mother of all lame duck sessions after this coming November election, because all those decisions are there. But I think the reason why I did that wasn't just because it was happening real time, but also because if you look at the structural problems in America's economy, rather than the cyclical debates that have been going on, and I do think this was premature talk of austerity in 2011 that luckily didn't translate into quite as much austerity as could have happened. I mean, as we're seeing, for example, in David Cameron's coalition government in Britain. But I do think that if you stand back a bit, it's not just the horse race that often, for very understandable reasons, the horse race journalism and the horse race politics that doesn't look at America's problems, but looking at America's fiscal picture from quarter to quarter isn't necessarily the right lens either. And so that's deliberate. Skepticism, I was fortunate enough to get a very prominent New York Times review of my book the other day, and the reviewer, Jonathan Rauch, very amusingly put in what was otherwise a positive review, but very amusingly suggested my book could be renamed "Time to Start Drinking," which did make me laugh. And I am conscious.
And I was thinking I would be drinking during this podcast, but it's a little too early, probably for both.
A little too early. I do have a Diet Coke on the go, which is always good. But the skepticism that I do have about how easy it is to turn around something like the stagnation you're seeing in educational outcomes through the K through 12 system. Is I think fairly well founded. It's taken decades really to get into this situation. As I quote John Hennessy, I think the president of Stanford, as saying, and he knows what he's talking about, and it'll take decades to really turn it around. That doesn't mean to say America shouldn't be starting in earnest and isn't looking for solutions in earnest, but it's not yet clear really that the kind of solutions we're seeing, notably the one that was really given its apotheosis in Waiting for Superman, that beautifully made documentary that didn't really put a balanced point of view. It's not clear that those solutions are yet really being put into practice or obvious to people who are seeking them.
Right, right. And of course, the other thing is that so many of the forces are kind of interlocked. So if you have, you write so powerfully of families that have really fallen out of the middle class, and you tell the story almost through the story of those storage lockers that represent people's kind of shattered dreams. When you have, it's a lot harder when you have a such more, a relatively broken and chaotic life on the part of a lot of people, to in turn make sure that the education system is so dependent on outcomes are so dependent on socioeconomic background. It's really quite staggering, and of course, you see that even here within the Washington D.C. public school system, which is one single system. The socioeconomic variables are far outweigh anything that the difference between good teacher and mediocre teacher. That essentially you could be fighting against a trend that's pulling you in the other direction.
Absolutely.
Which is not to say you don't want to do it. You want to do it. You want to do all you can to make to set up the right school system, to create the right incentives, whether it's charter or something else, whether it's what kind of incentives you want to create for teachers, how you want to get new people into the profession, or how you want to get people who shouldn't be teaching out. All those are good things, but we're expecting a lot from them that they probably can't deliver.
We're expecting a lot. I mean, the inequality of outcomes and the inequality of the distribution of growth issue is traditionally approached in America, quite rightly, and for very understandable and admirable reasons, as one of fairness. And I share that sense of that perspective too. This isn't a society that's particularly fair, and the tax system is in this respect pro-cyclical, becoming more pro-cyclical rather than counter-cyclical. But I guess what really strikes me more and more as you look at what's happening to the American middle class is that this is also a competitiveness. It's an economic efficiency question as well. I mean, I mentioned that term Latin Americanization in the context of inequality. But, of course, it also connotes a certain kind of politics. And I think when you have...
a certain what, Ed? I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you meant.
It also connotes a certain type of politics as well.
Yeah,
the Latin American model, perhaps less so nowadays in Latin America itself. But, it is that tendency in grossly unequal democracies to switch from populism to orthodoxy and back again, in great destabilizing lurches that make it very difficult for longer-term sensible structural sort of reforms and governance to take place. And so I do think that there is, and again, I'm not original in pointing this out, but there is a negative feedback loop there between the bifurcation of the American middle class, into a portion of it that's doing much better nowadays, and a portion that's doing worse, and in some cases much worse. And the polarization we're seeing in politics too. I do think the two are linked and they're mutually reinforcing.
Right. I think that's I think that concept of the lurch between populism and orthodoxy is that was the word you used, right?
Yes, indeed. Sorry, the line isn't as good as it could be.
No, it was just my memory of it. I mean, I think that's a really kind of a powerful way to think about it, especially given, there's such a strong argument that says, the left has to reclaim a language of populism. Obama needs to reclaim populism. So, almost like coupling populism with an economic message of lifting up the middle class, whereas in fact populism mostly hangs on the kind of reactive, sort of the Joe the Plumber side of as we know it. I mean, there's a possibility that there's something different. There's a possibility that Occupy Wall Street or something represents a different model, but I don't think we've quite seen it yet.
No, and I'm fascinated at the moment to observe as it unfolds, President Obama's re-election campaign and his evolution in terms of his narrative, his oratory, from 2011, which I think, what was exacerbated by some tactical errors there by the administration, and you can see the logic and indeed some of the gains that the president's already made from this switch since last fall, since last autumn. But it is strangely lacking in grassroots. It's not populist in the way we normally understand that word. This is, to put it mildly, I guess. I recently visited the Obama HQ in Chicago. Very impressive operation. Sort of beautifully organized and streamlined, and just to look at their YouTube desk and the number of bright people working there and the extraordinary library they've got of material that they're going to be unleashing. I'm not disrespecting their professionalism as a campaign, but the populism isn't the word I would use to describe Obama. I think he's doing a good imitation. But I don't think it's a good sort of mild imitation of a kind of modified populism. I think people are a little too give a lot. People who want to be populist often especially after the big job speech, which was last October or so, something like that, when the kind of deficit mania ended and he did a certain pivot. People are a little too quick to give him, now he's being a populist. Well, if you're really looking at the populist tradition in America, it doesn't quite sound like. No, this isn't Huey Long.
All find ways to work together.
This isn't Huey Long, but thankfully, I hasten to add,
That's right.
there is, we do focus. I mean, you made the point that the populism we are seeing is on the right mostly. It's the Joe the Plumber kind and across many of the Tea Party groups. And I think you're absolutely right there. And, that's where there are real limitations to comparing, what's happening in America with, say the Latin American sort of classic model, which we've just been talking about, is so much of what happens in a country, but particularly in America, is sui generis to that country. And what we see happening on the right here is unique, I think, amongst conservative parties in the developed world at the moment. It draws upon strands of America's history that, go back to the Whiskey and the Shays rebellions and, have carried on right through from the Know Nothings and so forth. That there is a populism there that is both right-wing and anti-elite. In France they call it Poujadist, but it's not really an exact parallel. This is a very American, and it is both fascinating, puzzling, and disconcerting, because I don't think there's a bigger, if you look at global warming, for example, or if you look at the treatment of multilateral institutions, it's very hard to imagine America playing a different or more constructive role until this strand in its politics right now has been made significantly less impactful than it is at the moment.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's the points that you made earlier and make well in the book about pragmatism are in a sense, it's a whole strand of American politics that aggressively closes off pragmatism as an option.
It does.
And that's very different from Ronald Reagan's conservatism, which had very pragmatic element, or most of what you and I have seen in our previous tours of Washington, right?
Most of what, and it's interesting you mentioned Reagan, because I spent a little bit of time in California for this book, mostly around Silicon Valley, but I do look a little bit at the politics there, and they say California is America's future, and indeed the world's future, but in this case, America's, and I think it is, and hopefully will continue to be, particularly in terms of technology, social trends, some social trends, not all. But I sincerely hope it isn't in terms of politics, but fear that it might be, because the use of minority blocking tactics from the filibuster onwards, and of course there with the ballot initiative, the referendum, to paralyze and tie up professional politics, is further advanced than it is in pretty much anywhere else in America, although there are others like Oregon, which aren't that much different. And, that's...
But Oregon's able to get, Oregon's not a completely paralyzed state the way, they have more initiatives than California, I think, most years, but they're not totally paralyzed the way California is.
No, they're not, but they have this funny rule where if their economic forecast is out by more than a certain pretty small percentage, it has to be rebated to the taxpayer, and that makes capital investment almost impossible. And of course, this is popular. People like getting checks at Christmas.
Right.
Nobody's
that's a variation of That's a variation of all those Tabor laws that were passed in the last 20 years or so.
Exactly.
Rights,
Precisely. And so that that concerns me, because there is a sort of Californiaization going on in Washington, has been for a while. California, the Republican Party is basically the Anglo Party, as it is in Texas. Basically, that's very sort of broad brush generalization, but and it's becoming smaller demographically over time. But as long as it's got a third of the assembly in Sacramento, it's enough basically to paralyze the system. And we're not far off that situation, both demographically and in terms of the tools of paralysis, in terms of Washington and the Republican Party.
Right. That's right. It's a politics in which paralysis benefits certain players, and they're going to use that, which is a little bit. Paralysis is even different from reactionary politics. We tend to think of paralysis as something that in sort of game theory terms. It's a tragedy of the commons, or some kind of fail. Two people each try to do good things. Somehow they get this result, which is paralysis. Well, that's not always true. Sometimes that's exactly what people want to create and benefit from. And I think that's the key thing there, is that it does go back, this question, from what you've just said, to the American people, because the reason they benefit from it is that the popular perception always blames the majority party for paralysis, even if the majority party isn't the one paralyzing things. And that's a very smart and savvy reading of public opinion, and it tends to tally. Right. I want to go back a minute, Ed, because we were talking about the Obama administration. I want to go back to this because there are a lot of really great characters that one meets in your book, and when I was at the American Prospect, I always used to say, what I always want is, I want policy stories that actually have people in them, and a lot of policy books don't really have a rich texture of people in them. And this one really does, ranging from a lot of from business leaders to ordinary people who are trying to make it in the world, to a community of economists. So I think you've tapped into sort of. I feel like this is the world of the most interesting economists and the most interesting, a few political scientists, people like that, who are actually really thinking about how the world. You almost define a community that isn't always visible. But the most interesting individual figure in your book that you write about, to some extent, is somebody you've known a long time, which is Larry Summers. And I thought that segment was really fascinating. I think because you felt that. What I got from it, and I want you to talk about it a little bit, is a sense that Summers had learned some things from the since the late 90s, when he was instrumental in blocking some of the or encouraging some of the deregulatory policies, but hadn't quite learned enough. And I don't know. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I first of all, what I should say, and I hope I made this clear in the book, is that I am a great admirer of Larry Summers. I think he's got a brilliant brain, and whenever I get access to that brain, I feel as if I've learned a lot of stuff. And I also think I was immensely privileged, particularly as a foreigner, to have been his speechwriter for a year when he was Treasury Secretary. That was a real. That's the kind of thing America does. Imagine an American speechwriter for George Osborne. I think there would be questions in Parliament. Although I guess we do. I mean, it works at different levels. We have had Americans, and do indeed have an American right now on our monetary policy committee, which is
and American, and there are the story of American political consultants making their way into British politics is an interesting one as well, and people, and that was a big issue with Blair, right? The kind of presidentialization of the prime minister. And
absolutely. And people like Stanley Greenberg and others have been heavily involved, and the Mark Pence and others of this world. So I did want to just preface your Larry Summers question with that, though, that it was an immense privilege. Yes, I talked to him in the book, and quote that interview at some length in the book. And I think what's clear about him in contrast to say Alan Greenspan or Bob Rubin or the other sort of high priests, if you like, of the late 90s, of that golden moment. In terms of America and how it was perceiving globalization to be going, was that I think he's been a lot more self-questioning, and of course he's played a very important role in this administration in the first 2 years during the TARP and stimulus phases of it. But I don't think he's questioning basic principles or basic nostrums. And where I disagree with him and many other economists today, in terms of the debate about the American economy, is I think there's an assumption that the machine is fine, basically. It just needs better fuel supply. And that what we're really lacking is demand here. And once demand is restored, but by hook or by crook, and if necessary, again, by more public stimulus, then the machine will work well. And what I would say is that might be necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient. And the last 3 years, almost 3 years, we are into this recovery. And it's, only in the last few months we've seen a 200,000 or more drop in joblessness. But it should be noted that, that's been accompanied by a continued decline in median incomes. And so the market is clearing at a lower price, even at the tepid rate at which it's restoring jobs. It's clearing at a lower price than where it left off before the Great Recession began. That tells us something deep and structural is happening here. Lack of demand really doesn't, for which lack of demand is not a full remedy. Right. Restoring demand. It's not a full remedy. During a worse period of the recession, let's say a year and a quarter, year and a half ago, it was interesting that there was a little bit of resistance. I don't know. You remember there was a moment where Obama pulled a lot of economists into the White House to say, "I want to hear the arguments about structural versus cyclical unemployment." Mm-hmm. And there was a certain amount of resistance to that because there was a worry that if you put too much focus on the structural element, you're gonna overlook the fact that we simply need demand, and we need more stimulus, and we need to get the overall economy going more quickly. So in a sense, some of what I think was coming out in, say, that wonderful paper by Michael Spence that you cite, and David Autor and some other people, Larry Katz as well, about really different ways of looking at the hollowing, at the longer term hollowing out of the middle of the labor market. There was, in a sense, some of that was shelved because of the recession, because people didn't quite want to talk about that because it was kind of a distraction from this underlying. Yeah, and I think and it's quite understandable in a political context. I'm aware. I'm as Teddy Roosevelt said, as like any journalist, a critic sitting watching the arena. I'm not in the arena, and so I appreciate there are real political exigencies here, and the political exigency debate imposed upon the situation by the rise of the Tea Party was for premature self-throat cutting austerity. Even to the extent of playing chicken with America's sovereign credit worthiness. And so, but the Tea Party wasn't the only force for austerity. No, and there were plenty outside the Tea Party too. And I think the Obama administration didn't handle the politics brilliantly either. But when you've got that kind of opponent to debate, then of course it enables the debate that should be happening, which is over the structural longer-term questions to be postponed indefinitely. The urgent is always driving out the important. And so I think that's part of the reason why, I mean, and I know, I mean, you will have much better insights on this than me, but I think that's part of the reason why, and I'd be interested to hear if you agree, that the expectations that many of us had in 2008 after the Lehman Brothers meltdown, that America had lost a paradigm and was yet to find a new one. But we had expectations there would be more debates about the model itself, and not just the short-term emergent. Once we were through the emergency, that there would be a debate about the model that led up to this, and the forecasts that got things so wrong, and whether it needed either replacing or at least recalibrating. And I think I'm surprised the degree to which that hasn't happened.
Right. I mean, I don't think that we have a good. I mean, there was that moment where sort of everybody did seem to get, at least they got the basic Keynesian element.
Yes.
So that kind of came back into play briefly, and then fell off very quickly again, and was forgotten. I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, in one way, I think we didn't. There isn't a very good. There wasn't a very good answer that also gave you the sense of, okay, we can get somewhere. I mean, there were a lot of competing forces, right, in the model. Part of it was put some bankers in jail now, right? Which you know, maybe right, maybe wrong. I mean, people should go to jail if they do things that they should go to jail for, but it doesn't, you know, and that doesn't necessarily. That might preclude people from committing crimes in the future, but or dissuade people from committing crimes in the future, but it's not going to persuade them from making dumb mistakes.
I think,
in the future. And then there was the sort of Krugman, you know, let's make banking be boring. That somewhat of the definancialization of the economy that you write a little bit about, and the way that, or you know, you write a little bit about the, you know, some of the work from the Kaufman Foundation about the way in which over-financialization is kind of actually been a drag on entrepreneurship, which I think that's like a huge open area for some really great for some work and thing. I found that really interesting. But none of those are really okay. That's an interesting analysis, but that's not like the path to prosperity. It's not like making banking boring is going to, you know, that we can, you know, it's not going to be morning in America again simply as a result of that.
I think it's absolutely. No, I fully understand why the moral. The moral outrage led a lot of the politics to this crisis, you know, because you know, some of the stuff that went on was outrageous, and how TARP worked, how people perceived it wasn't wrong. This was you know, a necessarily pragmatic but very, very distasteful, you know, thing to do in order to stop a depression. So I understand why moral response would lead people's reactions to this and the politics to this. But the problems are structural and do require, you know, space for, you know, more analytical debate too.
Right.
And I think that's been very difficult to do in Washington in the last few years. I know it's always difficult to do in any democracy. I'm not sort of fantasizing about the return of a Jeffersonian democracy, but I think it's been surprisingly lacking, that broader debate.
Well, you fantasize about return of a Hamiltonian democracy.
or Hamiltonian, yes, sorry. Jefferson was just a Pavlovian word sort of reached for in that context.
Right. Jeffersonian means Hamiltonian ends or whatever. I mean, of the people that you talk to, and I do think, I mean, I think one of the things that makes the book rich is the skepticism of some of the sort of glib, or I mean, I think you reveal some ideas as being kind of glib. What's there, you know, what's something that you came across and felt like this actually, if we could get this into the debate, it would really work. I mean, I feel like you have some of that interest in a kind of modernized, you know, kind of updated what people would call industrial policy.
Yeah, some
is that part of it?
You know, with some skepticism. I mean, the fact, you know, I think there is a lot to learn from Germany, amongst other countries. But Germany, you know, is probably the most obvious example in terms of saying that not everybody is actually suited to whatever class background they're from. Not everybody is suited to 4-year college degrees. Some people just don't like that stuff, and because they're different. But and not every job in the economy can be in an R&D center.
Right.
That there are distributions of aptitudes and skills to which the education system pays no attention. It's as if it doesn't happen. The only point of getting a high school diploma is because you need one to go on to do a 2, 3, or 4-year degree. That's the point of it. If you don't want to do a degree, what's the point of getting a high school diploma?
Right. Exactly.
Now, I think there are some sort of pilot studies that have been going on for a while on this. There's a career academies thing, to name one, where people get work experience during their time at high school, and they get earn credits from them and get drive towards a different certificate that is marketable. And I think there's studies that show that people who go through that process in the pilot areas that it's been in practice, that they're likelier to marry, rather the males in it are likelier to marry, have children older, keep down a job, and so forth. So there's practical stuff like that. I think, though, if you look at the broader difficulty, and this is where my skepticism comes in, if you look at the German model and how it's operated since '08, there's been lower unemployment in Germany, although it actually lost more growth. I mean, it had deeper negative growth than the States, but it had much lower unemployment. Right. And why was, well, partly because Berlin offered incentives for companies to keep people on part-time by topping up their wages, partly because there is a far more strong vocational culture there, and companies invest a lot in training their employees. Why should they want to discard that investment? And partly, because the culture makes unemployment less acceptable. And these things are not the sorts of things you can put in place overnight. And I'm not sure you can, I'm not sure you can divide into vocational and non-vocational, aged 14, as you do in Germany, in a country like America, in a ethnically diverse society like America, as easily as you can in a more homogenous one like Germany. And that would apply to Britain too, partly because of class diversity, is that people get suspicious. They're being branded. Are they being B-graded because they're not white, or because they drop their H's in England? And so it is more difficult, and that's you have to be skeptical about how easy it is to transplant a system that works in a specific context in another country to a different country. How easy that is to do.
Right. Well, there's also I mean, I always felt like I could see. I mean, the German model is fascinating, and there are elements of it that I find. I mean, even just the financial structure is the structure of finance with those. I can't remember what those banks are. The banks that are kind of tied to the
Landesbank.
Yeah, they're totally fascinating model. But in terms of human capital, you really are reminded that one of the stories of America is a kind of second chance. You are not locked into what you're going to be.
Yeah,
that's something that I think we give up lightly. Now, I've always thought another interesting element of your book, and actually something I hadn't thought about at all. I've always been one of the, for years and years and years, I felt like let's act. One of the great American miracles that both helps people get to a better place and does represent the second chance is community colleges. Yep. And of course, a lot of certainly kind of policy wonks thinking about education because they went to Harvard or Stanford don't kind of give community colleges the respect they deserve, but I've always found it, totally a fascinating model. And I know, basically, I think you kind of confirm this in the book, it's, 50% or so, maybe a little less of community colleges are, really giving people a good boost, really well connected to employers in the community they serve, cutting edge technology that's relevant to what will help people get jobs that are terrific. And the other half, or maybe more than half, simply aren't at that level. Now, what's great about your analysis and kind of opened my eyes when I was reading it last night is that, of course, that's not randomly distributed. It's closely tied to the economic capacity of the community, which in fact reinforces inequality. in its own terms, because it's kind of dependent on the tax base in that community. Northern Virginia Community College is a very good community college, and that shouldn't be surprising.
Absolutely, and tied to property values, as
Right.
a lot of school district funding is as well, and
Right.
that's a very good democratic feature of America, but it's also in this context problematic because it's pro-cyclical again.
Right.
Just when property values decline and therefore revenues from property taxes are declining is the moment where there are more and more people needing the training and retraining that community colleges provide. And, across the country, except in places like Northern Virginia, which the president has visited the community college there, I think, 4 times. Across the country, that means you've had severe cuts in community college spending. It would be nice to, I don't want to sound too pessimistic on the kinds of lessons you can take from Germany. There's lessons you can take from America's own history, though, on worker retraining. I mean, this is the country that produced the GI Bill, and I know that was to get a college education, but that was an inspirational, broad-based, the kind of example of something that combines equity with efficiency. They're not always trade-offs. Sometimes they're symbiotic. And I think a Marshall Plan for the American middle class might sound a little bit dramatic and also nostalgic and therefore misleading, but a much greater focus on the skills of the middle class is I think well overdue.
Right. Well, it's a great phrase. I mean, it's a reminder that you are probably as good a speechwriter, or at least as you are a journalist.
Thank you, Scott. I'm not sure either are true, but thank you anyway.
Right.
The only other point, there are many points around this, and it's been me more hogging than you. But I'd like to ask you: do you think the accent with which I'm talking about this isn't a particularly helpful one? And I'm aware that there are a lot of people, from my country who've, either sneered or over-adulated America, sneered at or over-adulated. And there are plenty in between, but we tend to notice the latter two categories. Do you think this is a problem at all in the way, I make these points? Because I'm very conscious of the fact that being British, almost comes with the expectation that you're an expert in decline.
Right.
And I wish to dissociate myself.
I mean, I was tempted. I am tempted to say, well, what is it? Because I've always been quite interested in it, and I try to. I read a decent amount of later 20th century British history just because I'm interested. Okay, what's that experience like of sort of in some and some of it being again actually willing to give up so much of the empire. I mean, that's such an extraordinary story when it really comes down to it. But also going through the experience of the war and so forth, and austerity. You're too young, I think, for austerity, Britain, right? But
I hope so.
but a lot of that experience.
I know I don't look it, but I am too young. But the
Are you there?
No, sorry, did you lose me?
I lost you for a
minute.
minute.
You lost me for a minute. Actually, well, you missed a facetious remark, so don't worry. But yes, I am too young for austerity.
I'm not even sure what that period is considered. I mean, but you're you're really a child of Thatcherite Britain, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't think that's a problem. I mean, I think it's a really interesting. I mean, many people. Look, I think you grasp all this better than a lot of Americans have, and whether some of that is an element of having a slightly. I mean, we are a little insular. We do have that tendency, even though we're not the one that's an island. To not be able to put it in that broader perspective. So I think that's super important. And of course, there's a long tradition of people being able to tell us. People who spent a lot of time here, but didn't grow up here, being able to tell us things about our country that we don't always realize ourselves. So I think that's fine. I mean, to me, what the book felt like, what the message felt like, was not only you're telling the story, but you've created, and I think I said this before, but I'm going to repeat it. What you've done, from my point of view, is you've created like a sense of here's a community of people like Michael Spence and other, people like that, and some of the inventor that you talked to. There's a community of people who are thinking smartly about this structural problem. And some of them may be people you've heard of, and some of them aren't. And you're kind of creating, by creating the story out of that, it doesn't really matter what you're asking. You know what I mean?
I suppose one of the responses I've heard, not just to my book, but to other people who make similar arguments in different situations, is look. Don't underestimate how good America is at pulling through in a crisis. And people cite the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, obviously, the war with Nazi Germany, with Japan, the Cold War, of course, civil rights era, etc. And I fully agree with that. And I think America, the 20th century would have been a dark century if America hadn't responded with unity and in the right way on each of the, well, not total unity on the civil rights issue, but in the right way with the majority behind it on each of those questions. I guess what makes me feel slightly self-conscious of not being American is that my then follow-up statement is to say, falling back today on exceptionalist comfort blankets like that, to say we did it in the past, is not sufficient. Maybe it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I think it's different also in that the challenges we've been talking about in our conversation, of globalization, of technology, of relative economic decline, are not uniting in the way, having war declared on you by Japan is uniting. These are very dividing issues.
Right.
And it's much harder.
Right, and something happened in the process. I mean, it's interesting being at the Roosevelt Institute because we try to say, well, how are we drawing on the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and where do you find that, where it's possible to draw that historical lesson? It's really valuable. And so a couple of our fellows are Rooseveltian historians and so forth. It's really, it's all really great to think about, but you're also reminded of the actual magnitude of what somebody was able, a single president was able to completely dominate communication with American people about the nature of the problems. He was able to manage the political process at a fair, he had a huge majority, was able to, basically get, choose where he was going to compromise, for example, on the limits that went into Social Security and things like that, but ultimately able to, in a sense, create the modern government almost from scratch, and then do it again in the Second New Deal, and then do it again in building the wartime. Those were big. Those were not things that we feel like there's any capacity. It's not just because Obama isn't as whatever as Franklin Roosevelt was. I mean, just that the conditions that made that possible. I'm not seeing it there. And then the question is, are there other things? I mean, I think one of the problems, and Jonathan Rauch's review kind of, with its sort of cynical, there's always an industry in American decline. He kind of alluded to this. We do often, there are books with a similar message in, the recession of the early 1990s, for example.
Indeed.
Which was when I was working on Capitol Hill, whatever. There was a similar feeling of like, returns to education are going down. The middle classes, of course, the middle class had been stagnating for 15 years, and now it's stagnated for another 20. So, it's obviously at a different, and it turned out the recession of the early 1990s was not that big a deal, and we were able to move fairly quickly to what was actually a pretty interesting kind of gap in the 30-year story, which was the kind of the full employment of the late 1990s. So if you look at it and obviously that it didn't require an FDR to get us out of the stagnation of the early 1990s, but at the same time, that wasn't, despite all the similar, books of counsels of despair, that was not a problem. It wasn't on anything like the scale of what we've seen over the last 5 years, and the real structural problems that, if you peel back, you can see.
Yeah, and that, I mean, the FDR majorities he had in his first term, that he increased in his first term, is something that's, clearly sorely lacking in this context, because, if Congress can't even get routine stuff done, like passing a budget 4 years running now, or will be, or indeed have proper funding mechanisms just for basic, plain vanilla transportation and infrastructure,
Right.
Or indeed renew the authorization without another game of chicken of the Exim Bank, the Export-Import Bank, which is so critical to America's export and therefore competitiveness position, and involves no taxpayer money, incidentally.
Right.
This is about a credit ceiling being lifted as well as the reauthorization. If it can't do that right now, the system, broadly speaking, then you look ahead to the mother of all lame duck sessions with some degree of foreboding.
Right.
And realize you need an FDR, or at least you need the conditions that would allow an FDR to operate, and they're just not here right now.
Right. Well, you really need the conditions more than you need an FDR.
Yes.
There were unique aspects to FDR's personality, but if we could dredge him up, I'm not sure he could do all the things that he was able to do. So I want to wrap this up. Actually, I want to shift topics for a minute and then wrap this up, because I forgot that I wanted to mention one of my favorite things that you've written recently, in addition to the book, was your lunch with Charles Murray. That regular feature in the FT of the lunch with. I thought that was I don't know. In a way, it was, here's somebody else who's sort of trying to tell the same story, tells it in very racialized terms of the decline of white America. He has this very odd, I'm just going to really recommend that people go and read that interview, and we can put up a link to it. But I mean, is there anything in his how do you look at that kind of conservative analysis, which is just basically, I think, comes down to, you people need to get your act together. How does that illuminate the kind of issues that you've written about? I mean, you've got a bunch of interesting books coming out at the same time. You got yours, you've got Tim Noah's, which is really focused on economic inequality in and of itself. You've got Murray's, which is coming at a whole, some of the same issues from a completely different perspective.
Absolutely.
So I just want you to reflect on that for a moment.
Again, to sort of emphasize, in my disagreements with Charles Murray, there's nothing ad hominem here. I found him as a person to have lunch with and discuss with, very open-minded, very friendly, and a really entertaining interlocutor. For that format, it's always good to get your interviewee to order a glass or two of wine. Or
a bottle or more, so top of the martini.
Or a gin martini.
Conversation.
Or a gin.
I don't know about your side of it, but his seemed to be well lubricated.
Yeah, I did have a tactical bottle of Pellegrino on the go, and so that's. But it's good because most people don't order wine with their lunch anymore, and he can handle his wine. I wouldn't want to suggest anything otherwise. But it was a good conversation. Where I would disagree with him. There are many areas where I would disagree with him in terms of his latest book. That this is somehow also a moral and ethical failing on the part of those who are losing out, or a cultural failing, expressed up to and including by their declining IQ. Relative to the IQ of the cognitive elites, those who live in the super zip codes, is I just think the wrong frame. I might have not characterized it particularly fairly, but just as shorthand, is the wrong frame through which to look at this. The middle class have had it tough, objectively and in reality, whether the middle class household you look at is a single parent family or a normal, or looks like the Osmonds. It doesn't make much difference. It's hit the middle class hard across in so many ways. And I think, the game has, at the political level has actually been exacerbating their situation. We're not seeing sort of big remedial efforts on the part of federal or most state governments to get them back into prosperous, broad-based growth. And I think that's not. It's a moral question in a different sense. Is how politics is funded in America, and those other questions are moral questions also. But I don't think these are moral personal failings of the victims of these changes. And I get the sense that's really what undergirds Charles Murray's view of the world. I think he describes the growing gulf between the cognitive elite and everyone else quite well. He captures that gulf quite well, but it's a very different causality that he talks about.
Right. I think that's right. Well, we didn't talk much about the issue of how we fund elections or how we fund politics, which is a big interest of mine, and plays a role in your book in I think a very well done way. I was just on a phone call earlier about some people who really believe there's some optimism about getting some change there. So maybe that's a place we can start.
Yes, that's in fact there was an interesting story this morning about New York, an effort for
right, exactly. That's what the call was about.
Okay.
But that's it's a long way before we can really get that at the national level. Well, Ed, I want to thank you for doing this conversation. I think it's going to be interesting to people, and hopefully we'll attract some people to your book and your columns.
Well, it's very kind of you to. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and I'm sorry I hogged more of the time. I'm sort of in talking mode at the moment, so
that's sort of what it's.
What
it's sort of about. This will warm you up for Charlie Rose, right?
Yes. No, a very good warm up. Really grateful for your interest as well, Mark.
Okay. Well, nice to talk to you, Ed.
Thank you.
Okay.